Reflections. Admitting Darkness as Darkness. Excerpts from Christian Moral Theology in the Emerging Technoculture. From Posthuman Back to Human by Brent Waters. The first task in constructing a Christian moral theology for engaging the emerging technoculture is, as George Grant insists, to illumine the darkness as darkness. Such illumination is required in order to deal with the world as it is. To a large extent, Grant has already accomplished this task. He describes, or to use his more favored term, enucleates, the late modern world that, having drunk deeply from the wells of its own nihilistic and historicist pretensions, is dedicated to asserting a technological mastery over nature and human nature. Consequently, justice is eclipsed into a calculation and assertion of self-interests, and historical necessity is debased into the good, a blasphemy used by the strong to justify themselves in crushing the weak. Providence is thereby effectively denigrated into a historical account told by the victors while silencing the victims. The net effect is, as Nietzsche saw with great clarity, a transvaluation in which ugliness is declared to be beautiful, falsehoods become truths, and good becomes evil, and evil becomes good. This profound insight can originally be found in Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good, and good evil, who put darkness for light, and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter. Grant's primary critical tools are drawn from Platonic philosophy and Christian theology. In the former instance, the eternal good is deployed as the standard of justice against which all human acts are measured. In the latter, the theology of the cross enables suffering to be taken on and endured rather than denied or justified on the grounds of necessity. When the late modern world is subjected to this cruciform scrutiny, it discloses the attempt at mastering nature and human nature as being encased in darkness, and when measured against the eternal standard of justice, the darkness is further exposed as darkness. It is this world which denies the eternal in pursuing the immortality of endless time, and which rejects the cross in favor of glory that must be refused. Although Grant's incisive critique provides an excellent starting point for a theological inquiry into and moral assessment of the emerging technoculture, it suffers from two fundamental weaknesses. First, it is not clear what exactly Grant is urging his readers to refuse. At times, he comes perilously close to suggesting that it is the darkness itself that should be refused. But this would be to mistake circumstances or consequences with causes. What is at issue, after all, is not assessing whether the darkness is good or evil, but what people do in the dark. At other times, Grant indicts rather sweepingly and imprecisely various political ideologies, economic systems, or technology itself. Yet, if these are the culprits causing the denial of justice, then it is not clear why they should be refused rather than reformed. This lack of precision stems from Grant's failure to offer, in any sustained manner, an account of judgment. Unless Grant is advocating a radical sectarian withdrawal of the truly enlightened, then the practical question of exercising judgment in a world that remains, at best, shadowy on this side of the eternal cannot be evaded. If, as Grant believes, the late modern world exists in the twilight of justice, then his reticence in addressing the necessity and practice of judgment is all the more perplexing, particularly if he entertains any hope of recovering the justice he is championing. Second, Grant offers few, if any, suggestions on where to look for signs of hope and grace in a world encased in darkness. This is a curious omission given his core Christian convictions. Indeed, he cannot declare the darkness as darkness in their absence. As a Platonist, Grant can expose the darkness, but it is only through the lens of the cross that the darkness is illumined as darkness and should thereby be refused. This refusal, however, begs a question that he never addresses. Late modernity is to be refused, but in favor of what? Christianity is not a restorationist religion, but is proleptic and eschatological. Its hope is not placed in returning to the Old Jerusalem, but in the New Jerusalem. But in Grant's scheme of waiting for a waiting God, all we have are memories of the old with few signs of what the new might entail. Christianity is, admittingly, a patient faith, but its waiting is expectant rather than passive. Christians wait for something in particular. In the absence of any substantive eschatological orientation, the hope and grace that sustains Christian faith become grim resignation and gritty pluck. Consequently, Grant can illumine the darkness as darkness, but not confess it as such. The late modern eclipse of justice is unremitting and irreversible because of the pervasive nihilism and historicism that denies any possibility of the eternal good. Consequently, suffering is endemic and unending, and can only be faithfully endured and lamented. The problem with this account, however, is not Grant's employment of the good and the cross as critical tools, but his incomplete Christology. The cross alone cannot reveal the fullness of God as the source of the good, for all it discloses is the suffering often hidden by the world's darkness. Hence, enduring and lamenting are about the best one can do. But the cross is not an isolated and self-sufficient event. Rather, it can only be properly understood in anticipation and confirmation of Christ's resurrection, exaltation, and parousia. Together, they reveal given and anticipated signs of the eternal good that Grant wishes to affirm. Late modernity's eclipse justice is therefore neither unremitting nor irreversible, for judgments can be made in conformity to these signs, thereby ameliorating the injustice and resulting suffering endemic to the human condition, albeit to a limited degree. And it is precisely in this possibility that the new and not yet can enter and renew the old, that hope and grace sustain the practice of judgment in the temporal pursuit of an anticipatory justice. Confessing the darkness as darkness necessarily entails a confession of culpability and possible renewal, the necessity of judgment, hope, and grace. In short, although Grant's critique of late modernity is incisive, it requires a more extensive and expansive Christology if it is to be effectual. Although it is first necessary to illuminate the darkness as darkness, it is not sufficient. To use Platonic imagery, the shadowy existence of cave dwellers can only be fully assessed and engaged with not simply by acknowledging the existence of the cave, but also by asserting that it is not a fitting habitat. In this respect, illuminating the darkness must be accompanied by the eternal good, that is the light or source of the illumination. Description must be accompanied by confession. The darkness described as illumined by the good must also be confessed as a darkness that is not suitable for the good ordering of human life and lives. Confessing the darkness as darkness, however, is predicated on a prior confession of the good that illumines the darkness. To some extent, Grant makes this confession, for he is, after all, a self-avowed Christian Platonist. But his confession is partial and therefore inadequate. He confesses Christ as the crucified Lord, but virtually ignores a resurrected and exalted Lord other than through an occasional cursory allusion. Presumably, this is the cost for avoiding a theology of glory. But the price is high, for Grant can only offer resignation rather than hope, and suspicion instead of trust. Consequently, the eternal good can only be approximated through a perpetual reenactment of the crucifixion, meaning that suffering is endless and without respite. Ironically, Grant's incomplete confession blunts the power and insight of his criticism. For whatever critique is offered, it can only result in more suffering, albeit in differing forms and circumstances. Without a realistic prospect of hope and rule of grace, the injustice he champions can never be enacted. In illuminating the darkness as darkness, Grant does not anticipate the subsequent possibilities of repentance, forgiveness, and amendment of life. At last we come to hope. Hope plays a paramount role in any act of judgment. At the most basic level, human action is predicated on hope. Any action undertaken by an individual or group does so to create an improved or more desirable set of circumstances. An infertile couple hopes that using IVF will result in a pregnancy and the birth of a child. A jury hopes that it has rendered a just verdict. Moreover, individuals and groups are, more often than not, drawn by multiple hopes. A hope that eating salads will improve my health, and I hope that the candidate I prefer will win the next election. A corporate board hopes its new venture will succeed. Following John Mercury, hope is always future-oriented toward achieving a goal or satisfying a desire. It is a universal phenomenon, and cumulatively hope takes on a totality since human action is always future-oriented. It is only when there are no options open, or perceived to be open, that there is a corresponding incapacity to act. Or, in more poignant terms, despair is the opposite of hope. Hope, then, provides the freedom and anticipated space in which to act, hence the necessity of judgment to create this space. Mercury warns, however, that hope does not inspire brash or reckless action, but, rather, entails humility and tentativeness that results in provisional action. Hope is therefore not synonymous with progress, but is a steady and patient pursuit of the good. Mercury's caution stems from the fact that humans are often drawn by a bad or false hope, or a good hope might inspire deficient or inapt action. Unfulfilled or unrealized hope, then, may inspire constructive moral and social critique, or conversely, destructive warfare and violent upheaval. Consequently, although hope necessarily entails change, such change must have a good orientation or end in mind. Mercury's account of hope begs an important question. What is a good hope? Or better, what is the good that should be the object of hope? This is why Mercury admits that although hope is a universal phenomenon, it is not generic. Christian hope, for example, is different from other kinds, such as the hope inspired by progressive historicists. At this point, we need not enter the debate over the extent to which various hopes incorporate truthful understandings of the good. Rather, for the purpose of this inquiry, we need to fix our attention on the particularity of Christian hope. Hope is a virtue that helps the believer attain the good of God, which is the ultimate object of hope. Faith, then, precedes hope, for it is only in and through faith that God is known, and hope, in turn, expresses this faith. Since hope is a virtue, however, it is not a passion but a habit of mind. One must practice hope in order to become a hopeful person, whereas an impassioned hope may be vulnerable to utopian dreaming and reckless action. Consequently, despair is not merely the antonym of hope, but a deadly sin, for it inevitably results in aversion to God. Unlike the act of foreclosing some options in order to enact a judgment, despair entails the effective foreclosure of all options, thereby making the rendering of a judgment impossible. Foreclosing all options is a kind of final judgment, but it is nihilistic and destructive rather than creative and renewing. It annihilates space for any further action rather than creating new space for further action. Christian hope, therefore, is essentially eschatological, for it is in expectation of Christ's parousia as creation's eschaton, which both enables and constrains meaningful and purposeful action in the present, that is, teleological action ensuing from judgment. The parousia of God's final salvic action fulfills the deepest human longing because it provides eternal fellowship with the triune God. God's future is both the origin and end of creation, and the ensuing basis of hope is nothing less than the promise of God as Creator and Redeemer. Yet, if this hope is to enable real and effective action, then there must be some assurance that wrongs will be ultimately righted. Otherwise, proximate and penultimate acts of judgments incorporating and anticipating this expectation cannot be undertaken. Consequently, Christian hope is lodged in the promise of Christ's parousia, and the fulfillment of that promise requires a final judgment. In the meantime, the hope of renewing human life is sustained by this promise. When time is taken into eternity, the circle of judgment, foreclosure, action, and assessment comes to an end. And in this ending, there is the final judgment of truth and justice. But unlike the counterfeit version stemming from despair, it is a judgment that purifies and does not destroy. If Christian hope is to inspire judgments that create new and renewing spaces for concrete and effective action, then a more complete Christological framework for moral theology is needed. The singular yet trifold crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, culmination of the Incarnation is needed to sustain hope in this period between the times of fulfilled and unfulfilled promise. As seen in Grant, when attention is fixated almost entirely on the cross, the resulting hope is at best a forlorn one, resulting in refusal rather than renewal. Or, to invoke the pattern of the liturgy, there is confession but no subsequent repentance, forgiveness, and amendment of life. In the virtual absence of the resurrection, there is no vindication of created order. Such vindication is needed to avoid a Gnostic disdain for the world, which can only embrace a hope in its negation rather than its transformation. Yet, if Christian hope is grounded in a transformed creation, its antecedent ordering cannot be disparaged, and neither can such hope be sustained by disdaining the world. Rather, hope is directed toward the promise of Christ's parousia, and is sustained by the exalted Christ who has entrusted sufficient authority and power to sustain and orient creation until the promise is fulfilled. It is the ascension, then, that validates and orients this hope. But this side of the final judgment, it is hope that entails imperfect judgment and action, never quite entirely discerning right from wrong, good from bad. Consequently, it is a hope that cannot fixate solely on Jesus to the exclusion of Pilate or any other humans exercising authority. It should be stressed that Christian hope is not merely a countervailing force to late modernity's nihilistic despair. The will to hope is not contending with the will to power. Otherwise, one would simply be the flip side of the other. Rather, hope demonstrates God's promise to reorient the ordering of a vindicated creation over time toward its destiny in God's eternity. This orientation does not involve a Christian refusal or withdrawal from the emerging technoculture, but an engagement that is both critical and constructive. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. John 3, verses 18 to 20. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this content to be useful and or meaningful, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe, and also to comment. I can be found on other platforms such as Patreon and Rumble if you choose to subscribe to those platforms as well. Thank you again, and God bless.